We came out of last week discussing the English Bible up to 1611. And what was the big translation that came out of 1611? King James Version, yeah, the traditional King James Version. You need some hangouts back there? You guys good? Yeah, the King James, it was really the culmination of a lot of work over a long period of time. And remember, we discussed the whole journey of the English Bible up until that point. There you go, sir. That there was an effort in the 14 and 1500s to get the Bible into English. Because there was a lot going on with England at the time. Obviously, it was a rising nation. There was some struggle with, between England and the Catholic Church, and so there was a real push to kind of reform the church in the English world, and that drove an effort to get it into English, to get it out of Latin, where the Bible had really been for 1,200 years. The official language of the Christian Bible was Latin. And so we got to a point where, hey, we need to really move out of that. Society, politics, science, everything was kind of where it needed to be to get this moved into a modern language. And the result of that was the King James. And what are some of the merits of the King James? What are some of the things you think about? What did we talk about last week? Or what are some things that you might think about when you think about the King James Version? Yes, Tara?
It's written in a language that we could better understand because you said it was written in Latin. I think back at that time, there's certain people that had to read it and explain it, where we can now read it and understand and know that they're telling us what.
That's right.
We can check up on people.
Yeah, remember one of the precursor Bibles of that, ones that went into the church, remember they actually opened up the Bible and people could come see it now with their own eyes, and if they were able to read, they could actually read that. And remember some of the priests complained that people wanted to actually read it themselves rather than listen to us. So it really kind of drove that idea that people can start to consume it themselves and not have to be told what it contains. So yeah, pretty powerful there. What else? What else came out of the King James? What else do you think about? Think about the King James.
We had the thous and the dimes.
Yeah, thous, these. I was thinking this morning, what's the difference between a thou and a thee, and ye, and whosoever's, and
wherefores, all
wherefore thou shalt goes.
all the legal terminology.
Yeah, so it sounds legal, doesn't it? Yes, it's an Elizabethan English. It's a classic English, high literary quality. If you think about when it came out, the time period that it came out of, what England was producing from a literary nature at that time. So very, almost poetic. When you read the King James, I kind of think in King James when I think Scripture. And a lot of the phrasing we have came out of the Tyndale effort to translate, and that came over to the King James. A lot of his only begotten Son, things like that. Those are Tyndale translation words that made their way into the King James, and that really became the lexicon of Christian language for centuries. Yeah. But then something happened, right? It was 1611. Has a lot happened between now and 1611? A lot has happened, right? The last 400 years, So we're going to talk about recent translations. The wonderful thing about the King James is you're going to see, I'm going to have actually a tree, I'll show you, that shows you how the Bible's, the translation tree happened. The King James was a springboard. It really took us into almost every translation that we have today, that we use in the church today. There are some ones that were tangential to it, but it really springboarded us into what we know as the language, the translations we use today.
I just, as you're saying, I think how much God is in control, because the foreknowledge, look at today, if you're in international traveling, what's the language that all the pilots speak? English. It's English, right? So it's like he already was looking to today and looks to tomorrow.
Yeah, the fullness of time. We talked about, God, how do you know God works? His timing is impeccable.
Right.
Everything happens at the right time, the right place. Whether it's the coming of Jesus, or the prophets going silent, or to be written in the right language, or be translated in the right language, everything happens at the right time, right? So, Latin was needed when it was needed, right? Because it was the language that went out into Europe, right? Then there became a time where Latin's not good enough to go out into the world. English really became the driving language at that time. So, recent translation. So, you see a bit of a tree here. Hope you can see this. But you've got the Hebrew Scriptures and the Septuagint were happening all before the arrival of Christ, obviously. Septuagint around 250 BC. That was an effort to get the Hebrew Bible into a Greek language that the people that modern world could read. And then you have the New Testament writings somewhere from 40 to 90 AD. You've got the actual writings taking place themselves. Then the Latin Vulgate comes along about 384 AD. This was now an attempt to translate the entire Christian Bible into the modern language, get it out of Greek, get it out of Hebrew, get into something that society can use. And that was the Latin Vulgate. And then that lasted for about 1,000 years. The Latin Vulgate dominated the Christian scene for about 1,000 years. Then somewhere in the 1500s, you started to have a strong effort to get it into English. And that was Tyndale and others that really started to say, let's get this thing out of Latin into English. A lot of turmoil there when we talked about that. Tyndale was put to death for that. And there was actual burning of English Bibles taking place in Europe at the time. So a lot of strife going on with that translation effort. You're really defying the religious order at the time to get out of Latin and get into this vulgar language, English, But we made it through that. And a few things that happened when we came out of that was government at the time then, in England especially, saying, okay, let's settle in, let's have an official Bible. Let's not have Drew's Bible, which is what Tyndale kind of was. It was this single man's effort. Let's get into some officially recognized translation. That was the Matthew's Bible of 1537. Again, it was accepted by some, resisted by others. We said that translations at that time tended to contain a lot of commentary. And that was primarily the driving force of the discontent. We have commentary in a Bible. If I do a Bible, do you really want to get my thoughts? How much do you want my thoughts, right? You want to get the word, right? And if it gets consumed with my thoughts and my interpretation of it, that's why I don't particularly like commentary Bibles. That's just me personally. Just give me this in my own brain, and I'll figure it out. Yes, sir.
On the other hand, if some people look at the English language and say that's vulgar.
That's right. Exactly right. Yeah. Kind of sounds rough. I asked some European colleagues one time, how do we sound? He said, we sound like this too, and we sound real like a bunch of hillbillies. Okay. So we're not quite refined, are we? But that produced the Matthew's Bible. But then, again, there were churches weren't accepting it, but the people wanted it. And so that led to the Great Bible, which was, something the churches could accept, but maybe wasn't accepted by the people. So you had a lot of this my Bible, your Bible thing going on. The Geneva Bible of 1560 was the one that they feel the Pilgrims brought over here. That's probably the one that came across the ocean with the Pilgrims. It was called the Geneva Bible. It was English, but it was printed in Geneva. And all of that lack of harmony about settling on a translation is what drove the King James effort. 1604 was where it really kind of conceived. 1607, the translation effort began, finished in 1611. And what that produced was a Bible that the churches, leadership, the people could all settle on. Remember, no commentary. Try and get word for word as much as you possibly can, but be very high literary quality. That was the King James Bible. It was to bring peace and harmony. Do you think it brought peace and harmony? Of course. It worked pretty well. It did. I mean, it's still hanging on today. A lot of people still read the King James. Again, we said the King James of today is highly revised from the one of 1611. So, and what we found was there were probably around 400 revisions took place just in the first year or so. Just grammatical errors, corrections, things like that. Yeah, Mike?
And I don't know if this is about the class or not, but it's still the same thing today. You've got churches that say, well, we will only accept this translation. That translation, you're a heretic if you follow that translation.
Yeah, that's right. Because when I start to translate, it's like, am I telling you exactly what this guy's saying, or is it passing through me and getting, is it getting my tilt? Is it getting my thoughts, or am I translating directly through? So you're relying on the good intention of the translator, right? What are the intentions of the translator? So there is some that takes place. That's why you want an interlinear. That's why you want a good, Greek lexicon or something. You're going to go back and say, well, what was the meaning of that word? And so that's why we have other translations today. Is because even the King James doesn't really speak to us today, right? We're going to look at some examples of that, where the meanings of these words are so different than they were 400 years ago. So it's good to keep looking at it and keep refining it. The King James relied on inadequate original manuscripts. That was the thing about it, okay? Did not have the access to the Greek manuscripts that we have today. Remember, this thing in England, where was the Latin Vulgate sitting? Or where was the Vatican manuscript sitting? In Rome, right? So I don't have access to that, right? The Sinaitic wasn't discovered until the 1800s, so they didn't have access to a lot of these big Greek manuscripts that we have today. Contains many words that seem archaic or obscure, right? That's very true. We just talked about some of those. Words have changed meaning, right? A lot of the grammar they used in the original King James really isn't in use today. There were errors in translation, right? If I'm going to go through and do a summary, I'm going to commit errors, right? The real question is, who's looking at it, and are you willing to correct it and refine it? The answer is yes, right? There was an effort to refine. It wasn't like, hey, we did it once, you're going to go with it, you know, freckles, warts, and all, right? No, you're going to actually go and refine it, continue the effort to work. Isn't that just like we are in our Christian walk? Think about us being Christians, right? Are we completely spotless? It's about the effort to refine and improve and be better through the journey. And that's really the story of these translations. Like when you see that, I can live with it. Yeah, Terry?
I have to work with translators. I've worked with Native American translators, which the Navajo language doesn't have adverbs and adjectives. And then the Spanish, which we have, it's not like Spanish from Spain. And as you do that, you do lose some of that context and trying to think how to put it to them so they understand it, but also that I'm getting the proper message across. And then as I've learned that language, it's difficult.
I'm a native English speaker. It's really the only language I've ever spoken halfway decently. I took some French, but I can't say I understand, you know. Well, I think what you're saying is very, very true. In my business career, I've worked with a lot of non-English native speakers, and even though they understand and can translate the word, conveying the meaning is difficult. It is difficult. I've found that in life. It's like, they're getting words, right? You got it, yeah, but the meaning didn't come across. That's a hard thing to do. And if you go word for word, you might lose the meaning. It really takes the listener has to really try to grab meaning out of it, right? Which is why you have translation efforts that might be, let's get the thought translated. Get the thought across. Maybe that helps the non-native speaker.
I think England still looks down at the American language.
What is it?
Languages.
Yeah, two people separated by a common language, is what they call it? Yeah. And they spell things. They put the R before the E. You know, it's like, what's up with that? But yeah, it's very interesting. Yes, Mike?
Also going from one language to another, within each language, I don't know what you call them, colloquialisms, whatever.
Idioms.
No, that dog don't run, that means something to us in English, but if you translated that to French, that's not gonna make any sense.
Dog just ain't gonna hunt. I said, what? What are you talking about? Yeah, so those are idioms, right? We talked about that a couple weeks ago. They don't translate well. And the Bible has idioms. There's idioms. The original writer, especially in Hebrew, wrote Hebrew idioms. And we read this sometimes, we go, what? We have to really sort of say, what are they saying? What are they trying to tell us there? Yes, ma'am.
I found with the Santa Bibli, which is Spanish, and the King James Version, there's a big difference in the two of them.
Oh, yeah.
In the way that they translate the times and the changes of the world.
That's right. Yeah, that's true. And think about the King James. It's a 400-year-old translation essentially from Latin, checking against some Hebrew and Greek. Yes?
Also, what they did and what was common during that time period, and everybody would understand, we would, like, we have no idea what shepherds do, actually.
Yeah, the life of a shepherd. Yeah, that translated well to an agrarian culture.
Because everybody knew shepherds, everybody had shepherds in their life, and they understood what it meant to be in the fold, which is not what we, in our brains, think.
Yeah, I think of that too. We have idioms, punch the time clock. I guarantee you, my children's generations are going to understand what it means by punching the time clock or put pen to paper. What? I don't put pen to paper. What are you talking about? All those things that we say that are idioms in our language may not mean anything to the next generation.
Or was common during that
Right.
time period is not common now.
Yeah. The record skipped. What? The record skipping? What are you talking about? Yeah, my iPod never skips. Anyway, there were some errors in translation. Hebrew and Greek scholarship were not where they are today. Okay, it has grown immensely over time, and there were some times in the original King James they might have used multiple names for the same person and caused some confusion. And maybe you've even seen that. So there were some revisions that came along. There was a need to revise and translate. And the King James came under scrutiny by about the mid-19th century due mainly to the discovery of these ancient texts. Right? Imagine 1849, I think it was, you come across a Sinaitic. It's like, uh-oh, whoa, what's this thing saying here? Right? Hang on. Right? Let's readdress this. Because it used the Latin Vulgate primarily as the basis for its translation. Let's just keep that in mind. The Convocation of the Province of Canterbury, 1870, called for a complete revision of the King James, and so that really led to an effort, what essentially became known as the English Revised Version of 1885. And if you look here on your outline, there's some examples of some places where the wording has started to change. Right? There's some archaic, obscure things in there. Have you ever heard anybody, suffer me this? Have you ever heard anybody say those terms? Suffer me this. What are they talking about? What does that mean?
Wow.
Allow. Yeah, but do we talk like that? Right? I mean, I guarantee you, my children don't use the term suffer to allow, right? Let might mean hinder. There's all kinds of things like that where meanings just kind of, word usage really changed. And again, if we look at the literal versus the translated wording, sometimes things are a little bit different. So if you look up ahead here, you'll see the King James would say something like, I can do all things through Christ which strengtheneth me. The literal translation, so if you take the literal word-for-word translation, it will say, all things I can do in the one empowering me, Christ. So to make it literal, you can see some changing of the words. The New American Standard would read, I can do all things through him who strengthens me. So you see just a little bit of a refining of the language was necessary there to make it a little bit better understandable. You'll see there are some, and also in the outline here, you'll see some slight errors they found, where there was some changing of wording and sentence structure to try and make it a little more readable, a little more accurate. And that produced the English Revised Version of 1885. Also, some committees met on their own to try and, say, well, hey, maybe we can do a bit better job. So there was this, the king launched the effort in 1607, right? That was a monarchy-led effort. What's going to happen by the 1800s? What's changed between 1611 and 1850? The United States. Yeah, a good chunk of the English-speaking world said, King George, you just go up and do your thing. We're going to do our own thing here. And you think they're going to necessarily follow the direction of a bunch of folks across the pond on the translation? No. So you started to have these two separate English efforts taking place here. And
We got away from England when we built the United States.
yeah, that's right. That's right. And so what happened was the English were brought in. So the English Revised Version was a joint English-American effort. So there was an American team, there was an English team, but the British committee made all the decisions on what was going to go in. And so there were some divided opinions there about which idioms you would want to include, British idioms, American idioms, and the distinction of spelling. We've already talked about that, how some spelling differences had already come about. The British finally agreed to print the American preferences in an appendix, with the Americans agreeing that they would not release their own edition for 14 years. Look at the negotiation that went along there, right? So, what do you think happened 14, 15 years later? Yeah, the American Standard Version eventually came out. So the Americans released their revised version in 1901, known as the American Standard Version. And it differed, very little from the English Revised, except in use of some idioms and spelling, and maybe some word order. So just the thing to keep in mind is by the time this effort happens, in the mid-1850s, you've got access to some Greek manuscripts that they did not have back in the 1600s. And Hebrew scholarship had improved immensely over that time as well. So you're able to produce a much better output in the 1800s, early 1900s than you could have in the 1600s. So the American Standard was considered to be much more accurate than the King James, but still retained many of the archaisms, right? Because it was trying to give it that biblical flavor. They were trying to still keep that feel that the King James had. So the American Standard was really criticized for not reading very naturally. It was called to be strong in Greek and weak in English. That's kind of interesting. So you had this. So you started to see a departure now from the King James. This is where you start to see something come out of that. You have the King James 1611, English Revised Version of 1885, and the American Standard Version of 1901. Thoughts, comments so far? Where these? You probably wonder where these different translations come from. When you think about the tree, you start to see how they start to, and it really starts to split off as it keeps going.
You have some cultural differences, and like in the American Standard, what's doulos, the word for servant slave in Greek, but here in the American Standard it's translated servant, and in the
King James is
slave, yeah, because they didn't want the negative connotation with the word. So you had those cultural differences happening.
There's something like what you were talking about just a minute ago. You know, what is a slave today versus how they looked at a slave 2,000 years ago, right? And I've gotten into some debates with fellow Christians about that. You know, does the Bible authorize slavery? Well, it says slave. I'm like, okay, well, it's an understanding of what we understand slavery to be today. Is that what you were talking about? I mean, and was it a translation issue? Right? I mean, so there's so many things that have to be considered there. When you talk about culture, just the culture from here to here, from King James to the English Revised, it had changed enough to say, we need to redo this translation. These words already, think about it, from 1600 to the mid-1800s, that's a lot happened in 200 years with the English culture. And then you had this American direction, right, really starting to drive. I remember reading, even in 1776, Philadelphia was the second largest English-speaking city in the world before we were even a founding nation. So there was a huge cultural machine running that was driving this. You had a thought here. Yes, sir.
I'm convinced that when America tried to pull away from England always, and maybe even still today, thinks that America is vulgar.
they call us troublemakers. Yeah, we're troublemakers over here. Yeah. I was in England several years ago for the 4th of July. I think there was a soccer match going on. I was there on the 4th of July. I had a good time. I was so obnoxious on the 4th of July in England. I mean, you can imagine. I was having too much fun.
That's where it's America.
That's right.
So I have a
Yes.
question. So when it went to the American Standard,
Mhm.
did it lose a lot of its poetry type of?
They tried to keep it. That's what they were trying. The American Standard was trying to keep the literary quality of the King James and the Revised Standard, trying to keep that literary quality, but just fix some idioms and spelling.
Gotcha.
Yeah.
Is that why they said more Greek than American?
That's right. Yeah, it's strong on Greek, weak on English. And that was, of course, who do you think is saying that? Right. So the Revised Standard Version. So again, this became known as a revision of the American Standard. Funds were made available in 1936 for a revision of the American Standard of 1901, and the goal was to retain the excellent translation qualities that he could read the Greek and Hebrew, but have better literary qualities. One that read more like the King James. So you'll see, like the American Standard would say in Matthew 21, "He will miserably destroy those wicked men." What is that? I don't even know what to make of that. What does that mean, right? But RSV would read, "He will put those wretches to a miserable death." Okay, I understand that. So it's fixing some phrasing there. The New Testament was finished in 1946, completed Bible in 1952. Anybody reading Revised Standard? Anybody?
I have.
Used to.
Yeah. It was a very, very, very popular English Bible for a long time. So, again, it took advantage of some recent discoveries of some Greek manuscripts too. Yes, sir.
I've read where they grade how educationally proficient you need to be to read the different versions. So like what grade level it is, and the Revised Standard, I think, was one of the highest.
To be able to read it?
Yeah.
Oh, wow.
You need a dictionary. That's
interesting, yeah, yeah. That's interesting, yeah. It may be an interesting
Even
study.
higher than the King James, I think.
Yeah, yeah. So again, it took some advantage of some secular papyrus that had been found to verify meanings and correct some translations. So we do that a lot, right? We say, what does that word mean? Or where is it used in their culture? Because that's where the language came out of. What they use that word for? So you'll see there's some examples in the outline here of some translation words being tweaked and changed a little bit. But it still contains some faulty translations, right? I mean, you see sea monster for whale, convict for convince, decided for determined, things like that. Where it's close, but again, it's about getting the meaning across. What meaning you're trying to get across. The Revised Standard Version, the 1930s, 40s, very important Bible that came out to try and resolve some issues of the American Standard. The New Revised Standard, the goal is to produce a revision of the RSV. So you see how it's always an effort to, we do this work, and then we say, oh, we can do better. Everything's a revised or a new, it seems like. So this was altering some paragraph structure and punctuation, reduced some archaisms that still remain. It's thee and thou removed when used for addressing God. That's interesting. Interesting way of looking at the how you address the Father. Attain better accuracy and clarity. This is another interesting thing about English. English does not have a gender-neutral pronoun.
Yeah.
So, now, not all languages, a lot of languages have gender-neutral pronouns. So, we got to be careful when you go talking about, the King James was pretty heavy on this. Since you have a gender-neutral pronoun, what was the cultural behavior of the day? Hang on. What was the cultural behavior of the day? If I was talking about anybody to do something, what would you do? Would you say they? Well, they's a plural. Would you say them? Well, it's kind of plural too. Him. So that was and like I said, I took some French. French did the same thing. It's like if you had a they and it was plural, use the masculine they. So just understand that we don't have a gender neutral pronoun. We don't have a way for saying that. So the New Revised Standard Version tried to fix that. So you can see here, they will eliminate any masculine-oriented language when references are made to both genders. So, example, one does not live by bread alone, as opposed to man does not live by bread alone. There's an example, right? So, and I understand what you mean when you say man does not live by bread alone. I know what you mean by that, but we're not talking about just men. We're talking about mankind, people, right? What sounds better? What reads better? To say one. So this translation, one of the things they did was try and fix that type of thing. Yeah, Jim?
It is gender.
That's true. I don't like to refer to people as it, but you're right. That's like somebody's child. Shut that. Yeah, it won't stop yelling. You usually say that baby and stuff, right? We don't have a way of we don't have a gender. It doesn't. It's not. We're struggling for a word in our language to say that person. So we say it, right? They, them.
I don't know that England has ever gotten away from the idea that Americans are vulgar.
That's true. We're hanging on to that, aren't we? Yeah, that's true. Well, they're just going to have to get over it.
Yeah.
So anyway, the New Revised Standard was an attempt to do that. You can see as we came into a modern society here in the 1900s, it's like, well, I mean, is it? Are we talking about him or are we talking about them? And we're trying to fix that in our language. And so we've just taken they and them and made them gender neutral. We've just done that in our language today. And you see that even happening even more. That's kind of turbocharged today, isn't it?
More so
To
today.
say the
That's
At
right.
that time that
That's
this
right.
was going on, this was when women were trying to also speak up and say that they're people.
Yeah.
Versus when you read and it's like man, people were taking that as man
Yeah.
versus mankind. So women were being treated worse,
My favorite example is that was that prayer somebody led in Congress a year or so ago. It said, "Amen" and "Amen." And that's my favorite. I was like, okay, stop. Stop it, please. So again, the new revised standard began working in 1974. Was published in 1990. So fairly recent, right? Not a new translation, but a revision of the RSV of 4652. So if you think about that, that means that the Revised Standard Version we have today traces roots back through the RSV, the ASV, the King James to Tyndale. These all are one big long stream. Remember we talked early on that when you go start a new translation from scratch, that is a really big undertaking. It's a lot easier to take what's already been done here and correct pronouns or mess with a sentence a little bit than to go back from the original Greek and start from scratch. That's a big ask. It's not done very often.
This is just kind of off the cuff. So I had an
Off the
uncle.
cuff or off topic?
Well, it's still on the topic.
Okay.
But off the cuff. I had an uncle who was a professor of French and Spanish and English. So he was versed in all three languages. And he lived in Canada. And what he wanted to do and thought was fun is devise a Spanish, English, French dictionary to align all of them so people would understand the language when you're trying to speak another language. He took on this task and he worked on it 30 years. He had a room that was top to bottom shelving with 3x5 cards, totally filled the walls.
Imagine it's a huge undertaking.
30 years just to do one dictionary.
What's
I
every word?
can't imagine trying to do the Bible.
Yeah.
I mean, that was 30 years for a dictionary.
Yeah. We know what struck me is the translating effort had already been done. What's happening now since 1611 is what?
Trying to put it in our language.
Trying to modernize it, trying to update it so we can
Right.
understand it better.
So,
So it's not translating anymore.
no,
It's,
one man, 30 years just
I got
trying to get verbs.
got that, yeah.
How
Let's keep going.
imagine
Let's keep
the
going.
Bible could be that?
Yeah, actually, absolutely right. Absolutely right. So this has been an updating, a refining type of effort here. So the revised RSV or whatever it's called here now, what we at? It comes out now in the New English Bible is where we're at now. So the New English Bible was one of the first efforts to break from the word for word concept and get more into a sense for sense translation. Because if you think about it, you've had all this word for word effort going on now for 400 years, and look what we're struggling with. We're struggling with grammar and text and sentence structure, and look at the wrestling, 400 years of wrestling over refining English, right? And so now it's like, well, why don't we actually go for a different concept here? Let's get a sense for sense. So the New English Bible was really one of the first efforts to do that. And you can see here some, bless you. So John 1:1 is an example of that, right? Where the literal translation of John 1:1 is, in the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. That's how we understand the New American Standard, the King James to read, right? The NEV would say, when all things began, the Word already was. The Word dwelt with God, and what God was, the Word was. Okay, I got it. I mean, it's the same concept. I actually think the literal one reads better there, personally, but I'm used to it. All right? So you can see where it's the same concept, but phrasing is different. That's the difference between a sense for sense and a word for word.
The England people have always thought Americans are down the road, they don't know anything, and they won't listen to us.
Okay, well, that's fine. Yeah. So anyway, this came out in 1970, and the Old Testament was treated with a little bit of caution since it differed considerably from the Hebrew text. For instance, there was some rearranging in Zechariah and Job. So anybody read the New English Bible? I'm curious to see this. Have you seen it around?
Yeah, I have it at home.
Yeah.
But when you read that statement, word for word in the NEB, that there is no beginning with God. That's why they translate it. So when you read it in the beginning, what are you talking about? You're not talking about the beginning, you're talking about the beginning of here.
I guess.
Right?
Yeah.
So that's why they went that way
Yeah.
with it.
Yeah.
Because now you understand that there's no beginning.
What is the beginning? Yeah.
Right. He already was.
Yeah. That's right.
Sorry.
That's okay. And then the New American Standard, we're trying to close this out here in the next 5 to 10 minutes. So the New American Standard was an effort to refine the American Standard. So this is almost like a new undertaking here. There was a fourfold aim: be true to the original Hebrew, Greek, and Aramaic, be grammatically correct, be understandable, right, and then give the Lord his proper place, right. So it was an attempt to improve the ASV of 1901, modernize it, so it wouldn't disappear. So imagine you did this big effort to have an American Bible in the early 1900s, and if you're not careful, it's going to become archaic real fast, just like the King James. So it was trying to sustain it and keep it on. So this came out in the 1960s, and a new edition was issued in 1995. I actually have a New American Standard it's my favorite. I like it because it's giant print. But I like the way it reads. Another thing about, I don't know if you ever noticed that the every verse is a paragraph.
Yes.
Anybody like the New American Standard? Anybody read this?
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, I like it. Yeah. So it goes. So the idea was to be grammatically correct as much as possible. Each verse is separated like the King James, and high reliability and fidelity to the original language. So that's what the New American Standard was doing. So now you start to see this thing breaking out a little bit, right? You've got a kind of a long string of coming off Tyndale and the King James here, coming down to the New Revised Standard, and then you start to see some offshoots where people are breaking from that string. And the New American Standard, the New English Bible, were a couple of those. And then we get to the NIV. The NIV, yes, sir.
They just revised the New American Standard last year.
Another one, new one?
No,
Okay.
2020.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And why do you think that is? Why do they keep doing that?
Keep improving the grammar, make little modifications.
Yeah. And to be, what you don't
More money.
probably, yeah, print more Bibles. But you want it to speak to who we are today, right? And what the way we want to hear things today. And the gender thing is a typical example of that. So the NIV traces its origins to the 1950s and a dissatisfaction with the RSV. Originated from a meeting at Trinity College in Illinois of the Christian Reformed Church. And the New York Bible Study was chosen to do the translation. And this was a pretty big undertaking. The NIV was one of the first efforts since King James to really start from scratch, where they used all the Greek and all the Hebrew scholarship and manuscripts that we could have to try and start over again. It was not a revision. It was a starting over, which is one of the reasons why it reads so differently. They sought to follow a balance of word for word and thought for thought, right? They were trying to, walk both sides of this. And there's been multiple versions of that. Like, I know we're using a 2001 here, I think. Is that what it is?
84.
84. It is the most widely accepted of the modern translations. I mean, the NIV is very, very popular. You go and you wander around in most churches today, there's NIVs there. I've been to some churches that just have NASBs in the Bible, in the pews, But the NIV is really one of the most popular. Its main attributes are clarity, readability. You can't argue the readability of it, right? I mean, it's pretty straightforward. But since they did not abide by a word-for-word translation theory, obscure expressions are often presented in more appealing phrasing, right? They'll say place of leadership for office, converts to Judaism for proselytes, things like that. So, considered to be mostly accurate, although the translators often use modern phrasing to convey the sense of the same message. So, remember, they're going with modern phrasing. That's the thing to keep in mind, to get the idea across. They've departed from the word for word. So it's trying to get the idea across. So if you get really hung up, I've seen a lot of Christians, preachers, everyone, get really hung up on, it says of, because it says of, it's like, man, you're using an English, that's a translated word. I mean, what was it trying to say? What's the point, right? So you got to be really careful that's why, remember early on I gave my 2 cents of what the best practice is when you're talking about trying to understand the word. You get a word for word, you get a thought for thought, you get a tiebreaker. And you have an interlinear. If you get down to wrestling over a word, the meaning of a word, we're gonna wrestle doctrine of a word. Let's go in and look and see. That gender thing's an example I'm talking about, right? I think you mentioned some languages don't have adjectives and adverbs and articles and all kinds of stuff. And so, you know, when you're translating a thought, you gotta understand you're trying to get a thought across. So you see here, there's some examples in Jeremiah here where there's a word here. I did not just give them commands. Well, just was added, right? There's an example. Dog has changed to your, you know, things like that. So the NIV, originally published in 1973, Old Testament published in 1978. There's been many revisions over the years. Accepted by a lot, scorned by others.
They just came out with one in 2011, and I think it's a step backwards from the 1984 version myself.
Yeah. It'd be interesting to do a study, do a side-by-side study. And,
Yeah.
you know, did you give up too much to be accepted? You know, that's the question.
Yeah.
You're giving up too much to be accepted to the masses.
I think the English, still today, think a whole lot of Americans are vulgar.
Yeah, we've covered that ground. That's true. Okay, other translations. So just to wrap us up here, Revised English Bible of 1989, attempt to be a substantial revision of the NEV. There's a New King James. Anybody run around the New King James these
I
days?
have it.
Yeah. It's got the poetic, literary
Yeah.
feel, but it's taking up the these, thous, and things.
There's a few of those left in there, but not too bad.
You know, the only time I have a problem with that is when we change it to song. That's my 2 cents. You know, the
Yeah,
song is
which way do we sing it? The or
It's the and the, yeah. It's the song, you know. It's not scripture, you know. The Good News Bible, 1976, originated as a request from people in Africa and Asia for a Bible that could be easily read by non-English speakers. Use a theory called dynamic equivalence. Again, what you're trying to do here, back to Terry's point, I'm trying to get this across to somebody who's not a native English speaker. How to get this point across in a different language. So that's a big ask. It's a big carry there. The Living Bible, I've seen that. It's a paraphrase of the ASV. I've seen the Living Bible come around. The Message is another one I've actually seen preachers quote from the Message. Yeah. I want a qualification on that personally. This was created as a paraphrasing of the Bible that would be for inspirational purposes, and that's where I've seen it used. It's considered by many to be inspiring. It does sound good. I mean, I've heard it read. It's like, it sounds pretty good. But even the creator said, I don't recommend this for reading in public worship or for doctrine. This is more of an inspirational. It's kind of like it's what a sermon does, right? It takes scripture and drives inspirational message. That's why it's called the Message, right? So just keep that in mind. And then the English Standard Version is one of the newest ones. I love the ESV. Personally, I'm going to go out on a limb. I carry ESV with me. I really like it. Follows a translation philosophy of the King James, the ESV, the ASV, the ERV. Relies heavily on critical editions of the Hebrew and Greek texts. So and it's a translation that emphasizes word-for-word accuracy with literary excellence. So the English Standard Version is probably one of the newest out there that you'll see that actually traces its roots back to the King James tree. Because you can see here where the English Bible, Revised English, Good News, the Message, they all kind of peel off from the American Standard. Didn't we start all that trouble? Kind of peels off there. And the ESV is one of the newer versions that got back onto the King James tree. So those are the English translations. Wow, in 45 minutes. Yes, sir.
The latest revision of the ESV is 2016.
That's a new.
So it's even newer.
Yeah. But it's always right. You're always trying to refine. I like that. You know, it's like anything. I mean, that's why I like multiples to weigh. We talk about some words that might be, you know, what's the meaning and tension here.
You know, some of the versions that would come out now, with what's going on in society,
Yeah.
would you really even trust them anymore?
That's why
If they're starting to be what's happening
I
here?
kind of like being on the tree here.
Yeah,
You know? I kind of like that. You know, that they weren't dealing with that stuff back then.
no, and I'm afraid that
Yeah.
it's gonna filter into everything.
Let's remain remnant. Yes, sir. Wraps up.
There are two significant ones that aren't on there. One is the World English Bible, which I've found to be the best. And another one is the Concordant Concordant Literal Translation. And they, as far as I know, it's only available in the New Testament. But what they try to do is every time a Greek word is used, it's translated to be the same English word.
Yeah, so it's going word for word now, yeah.
Yeah.
You're comfortable with the word. So I mean, everybody has to have where they, that's why I believe it's really good to have
It's difficult
this
to
balance.
read,
It's difficult to read.
but it
The
it
meaning
showed-
of the word.
If this word was used
Yeah.
in this place and it's used in that place, they translated the same English word both times.
Right.
So it gives you a better idea of what was actually
Yeah.
being used.
It's hard to do that and make it very readable for a young Christian or someone who's not, 50 years down the journey. That's the difficulty. That's why it's good to have a thought for thought along with that, to convey the thought and to inspire Christ in that, right? And then as you grow your doctrinal journey, it's like, let's understand really what, a little bit more, let's get into calculus and algebra 2. That's basically what it is. Thank you very much, folks. Next week we'll come back. We're going to wrap this whole story up and put a bow on it and conclude where we got the Bible. Sound good? All right. Have a good day, everyone.